Hello and welcome to the Falmouth Public Library's program of oral history. I am here today with two oral historians who will talk about the Falmouth Library's collection of historic postcards that trigger memories of Falmouth's past. It is March 11th, 2022, and we are going to hear about what was going on in some of the early days of Falmouth. Welcome to the program, and I'll let you introduce yourselves. We have the oral historians. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Otis Porter from Falmouth. Lived here all my life, and I was a teacher at Falmouth High School, and before that, Lawrence School, the junior high. But I was also a student at the Mullins School, which was then known as the Village School, and the Hall School, which was next door to it, which has been torn down since.
Yes.
And I arrived here in 1955 as a teacher, a science teacher, and later on and as an administrator. And I retired in 1994.
Yes. And Jim Kalperis is well known as Kalpe. His former students always had that affectionate term for him. So welcome to the program. Let's begin by looking at some of the earliest schools in Falmouth. Otis, you have some memories of that.
Yes, I do. The first school we'll talk about or mention in brief is the current Chamber of Commerce building on Academy Lane. And originally it was set up as Lawrence Academy after Shubale Lawrence around 1842. Donated $10,000 to create this school. It was a private academy at that point. Yes. And a little bit later on, the town of Falmouth petitioned the General Court or the State Supreme Court to take the funds and use it for a public school, and it became known as Lawrence High School.
I see.
And that was the genesis of the public school there in Falmouth.
I'm sure the early history of Falmouth Town Meeting would have records of the community coming together to make that vote.
Oh yes, they probably do, and the town records, like in Town Hall, with all those town meeting votes.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. So now we're coming to the before we talk about Jim, your experience of the first high school, that was the Lawrence High School. Tell us about what happened to that high school on Main Street.
Well, that was part of a 4-building green campus, I guess you could call it, before Catherine Lee Bates Road was put in there. And we'll mention about the elementary schools, but the old high school went up around 1891, and that was where the library parking lot is currently. And if you notice on Main Street, across from the Indian restaurant and the breakfast restaurant there's a sidewalk that goes up, and that was originally the sidewalk to the Lawrence High School from 1891.
Right.
Interesting thing that I was telling Barbara and Jim, when I was a boy going to Hall School in grade 6, the old Lawrence High School was torn down and burned right there.
You saw the ashes?
I saw the ashes. I saw the flames too. Of course, we wouldn't do that now with a public building or any kind of a building. Just burn it right there. But it was very interesting.
Right. So that Main Street High School got transferred to what is now the Lawrence School, the junior high. And Jim, you remember you were a teacher there at the new high school, where the Lawrence School is now.
Yes, and the stories I heard when the new Lawrence High School, and by the way, the movie Lawrence of Arabia came out at the same time, so it was, when I was involved in some of the sports activities, and so when we used to go to some of the other schools, "Here comes the Arabians," they used to say to us.
Really?
So it was fun, but I do remember some of the teachers that were in both schools, Hugo Tazanari and John Quick, and some of these names that I'm sure some of these people listening to this program, watching this program, will remember. They told me that the day the school opened, the students all assembled in the old high school, and whatever they could bring and carry by hand, they all marched from that school over to the new Lawrence School.
I see.
It was quite
Right.
an adventure.
Yeah.
I don't know, Otis, if you were part of that or not.
No, I was the second group to go in 1954. It opened in 1953.
Right. Well, that seemed like a convenient way to get some material transferred. Certainly sounds a bit like New England frugality, too, instead of hiring movers. That's pretty amusing. Now, you were a teacher at
Right,
that
I
school.
was a teacher, and that was interesting at that time because that high school was a 6-year high school, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. And it was interesting from the point of view that we could enjoy the younger people. It was nice seeing young people and the difference. Oh, yes, there were certain. I'm sure Otis remembers this too. There were certain ways you could enter the school.
Oh,
If you were a senior, you were allowed to go through the front doors and up the stairs. Otherwise, you entered on either one of the two wings
I
of the
see.
school.
The let's call them the underclassmen.
That's
Lower
correct.
classmen.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
lower
Yeah.
classmen.
Yeah.
Yes.
And when the lunch times came, the younger people ate first, and then they cleaned up the cafeterias, and then the older, I would say the 9th graders and up,
Yes.
went into the school, into the cafeteria at that time.
What
And
they
s-
did, Barbara, I was there for grade 7 through 12.
You were.
7th grade was on the lower floor. 8th grade went up to the next floor, but it was like on the wings, and the rest of it was all high school. And what Kalpe was just saying, that center staircase was reserved for staff and seniors only.
Yeah.
And you could never go up those center stairs unless you were escorted by a teacher.
And the funny part of that was that when the seniors graduated, the juniors, even though they were still juniors, went up those stairs.
So-
It was a lot of fun.
You mean it was a sort of rite of passage?
The rite of passage, exactly.
How interesting.
And everyone paid attention to it.
Really?
Yeah,
Really?
they did.
And I'm sure, yes. But now, were you a student there when it suddenly became very overcrowded?
Yes, I was a student there until 1960 when our graduating class happened.
I see.
And it was just starting to get overcrowded because a couple of years later they made the intermediate school, which covered grade
Right,
6,
right.
7, and 8. And I first started teaching there.
I
And then when the new high school, the current one on Gifford Street, opened up, we all transferred in junior high to Lawrence School. It was taken, the name Lawrence High School was
yes.
taken off and it went to Falmouth High School.
Yes.
And we
yes,
kept that as
yeah.
Lawrence. But there are some other things too we can talk about, if you wish, on the elementary schools.
Yes, let's get to that. While we're still talking about this newly built high school from Main Street to where the Lawrence School is now, there's something peculiar about the architecture because, Jim, wasn't it possible for some students to find secret passageways?
Oh, yeah, that's interesting in the fact that originally in the original plans there was an elevator scheduled for that school.
I see.
Well, for one reason or another, it never got built.
Yeah, cost
but
possibly.
the space that was going to be needed ended up being in back of the lockers. The lockers in that school were placed all in all the corridors, both wings, and even in some in the front.
Isn't that the way it is today?
Pretty much, yes.
Yeah.
So go on.
So, well, not at the high school. I
No,
haven't.
but at Lawrence, it's
At Lawrence, yeah, but at the high school they were all down in the.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, we'll leave that alone. So, at the time when I was doing certain administrative work, of which was disciplining youngsters and so forth, once in a while.
Not me, though.
No, but once in a while, somebody would escape and go running down the corridor. And obviously, I'd go galloping after them to see if I could corral them. And when I get around the corner, they disappeared. And I couldn't understand what happened. Well, after a while, somebody ratted out on them and told us what was really happening is that if you knocked out the back of these lockers, there was a big space there. And that space allowed you to move from one end of the building to the other. And not only that, you were able to get up into the attic off the second floor to the attic. And an interesting situation occurred that one year we were examining what was going on there, and for some reason we got up into the attic and there was an airplane in there. It had been built by young Teddy Tripp, Dr. Tripp's son, who was a magnificent, brilliant young man. And I don't know how he got all the stuff up there, but you know, the wingspan was at least 10 feet.
Oh my gosh.
And and I'm sure other things occurred up there. I remember one youngster, I was told, fell through the ceiling.
Oh, good grief.
You know, he stepped on the wrong spot and his leg came down through the ceiling. Those are stories that are history. Let's leave it at that.
Well, it sort of lets us know that students know how to make the best use of their time.
Exactly.
Although some of that might have been class time. That's really interesting. So let's go back then to the early. We did have a grammar school.
Yes, we did. The grammar school, when they went to public education, was on Main Street at the entrance to what's now Town Hall Square. It later became known as the community center. They had a little courtroom in there too, and some town offices before they tore it down in the 60s when the new town hall was built. And my mother happened to be a teacher there for a couple of years. Then they transitioned to a brand new school called the Village School. We know it now as Mullen School. And that was no kindergarten in those days. They had what they call a sub-primary. And that was like a voluntary thing for parents to send their children to, but it was grades 1 through 5, maybe 6. And junior high was the later building called the Hall School, which is about where the parking lot for staff is at the Mullen School complex. Now, interestingly enough, I was telling Barbara and Jim when we were talking before, Mullen School is named after the principal Margaret Mullen, known as Peg Mullen.
Right.
If you remember Peg
Flaming
Mullen,
red hair, yeah.
red hair, and every day she had something purple.
Really?
Every day. And those of us who remember her as a principal remember that very well. She happened to have lived down my street in Falmouth. So on occasion when I would go to school walking to the elementary, she'd pick me up and take me in. And not too many people can say they came to school with the principal. But I found out from a neighbor, Barbara, that I had taken the school bus outside of our street on Locust Street. And all of a sudden we weren't taking it anymore. Well, a neighbor found out recently, he was Googling my name, came across an article in the Old Enterprise. Our neighborhood and Pin Oak Way were kicked off the bus because we were within a mile of the school.
Oh, yes.
And a parent down off Palmer Avenue had complained because she had wanted her daughter to ride the bus and said, well, why are these kids riding the bus? So we were walkers. But I never knew that story until last year.
Oh, that's
I know,
very
and that's why
That was
Peg
quite
Mullen.
common. That
It
was
was.
quite
Right.
common
Yes.
at that time.
But
Walking to school,
not
yes.
going in with the principal
Right.
was not common.
You're right, no.
But that school that we're now, the facade is still the same. And you notice they had two wings and then the main section. And up above it says, "Learn to live and live to learn," were two mottos that we students, had to
Yes, yes.
learn to live with. And it was a nice green campus there. They had a large lunchroom. And the hall school, which we were saying, a lot of people think it was because of had a big hall in the center. But it was actually named after Henry Hall,
Right.
who was the principal
Right.
for the junior high. So you had the elementary school, the village school, or Mullen. You had the hall school for 7 and 8, and you had the then new high school, right where the library parking lot is. And the other part of that whole campus was the Falmouth Public Library. So it made a nice green,
Yes.
kind of an educational campus right there
Yeah,
on Main
yes.
Street. And we're fortunate to still have that pretty much the same,
Yes.
except for
Wasn't
the
the
road
police station
intersecting.
there too?
Police station was a little
Jim,
farther
But it
west.
was in that,
Yes, it was, behind the old town hall, which is
And,
where Peg Noonan Park is.
And I recall that when the new high school got going, it really did, we talked about when it became overcrowded. And then wasn't there a program to allow students to leave? And so kids were
Yeah.
going in and out, going to Main Street. for
I
lunch.
had the,
I can't imagine
esteemed-
how difficult that was for
Right.
keeping track of students.
I came to school on one day, opening school, and in fact I came in a little bit late. The assembly had started already, and Mr. Merson, who was the superintendent of schools, said, "We're going to have a new director. We're going to have a new program, and that director is Jim Kalperis." I had no idea what they were talking about or what I was supposed to do, but the program was called the Open Campus Program, in which there were 3 divisions. You see, the problem was we were so overcrowded. We went from a school that was built for 800 students to 1,700 students. And in order to get the classes, the variety of classes and subjects that we needed, we just didn't have room for it. Right. So they came up with the idea of eliminating the study halls and using the study hall periods as classrooms. And by the way, do you know what in setting up the curriculum and the way in which certain subjects would get priorities, do you know as far as getting the students they needed to get into a particular class?
Ability grading or something of that sort?
The first, Mr. Dick Jones was the one that was involved with this as well, was interesting because in order to get the people, the first one was the band. The band kids got the first, they had to have all the band kids for band practice at one time. So that changed the whole curriculum around us with relation to where they were going to, these other kids were going to go. And then you had the chemistry and the A1s or the whatever you had for different variety of classes. And we, at those years, we had shop. We had agriculture. We had shop and automotive. Those courses were actively, and kids had to come in, and so it was a very big task.
Yes, it sounds really complex, and it occurs to me that we did not have computers.
No.
That would have made scheduling. I'm sure it sounds to me as if scheduling must have been a nightmare.
Well, now it's making me wonder because I was in the band, So all these years, I thought my classes were based upon my ability, not because I was just in the band.
Yeah, yeah. You had to be available.
Right.
Yeah, some of the other things that went on at that time was, which was nice, that when it came time to put the grades, or master grades and put them so they would go on the report cards, we used to sit in teams of 3 that were for the same grade level, 9th or 8th and so forth, because we were able to you know, be involved. When you had 5 preparations those years, all different, like 8-1 or 9-1 or 9-2 or 8-6 or whatever you want. And so and what we did was we'd sit down in 3 of us and we'd say a name, Otis Porter. And I'd say, well, I'm going to give Otis an A because he's in general science at this time. And then there was a math teacher there, and we'd compare. So when we got to a certain youngster that there was, we had B pluses and A minuses and so forth. Sometimes a youngster would go from a B to a B plus, only because of what we heard and how that she or he were in that other class.
I see.
So that's the way that went on at that time. And it was kind of nice to sit back there. Of course, we all wanted to do the best we could.
Yes. Do you know, that might be considered in modern pedagogy an innovation.
Yes.
An interesting way to think about assessing a student, sort of like the portfolio system. So that's sometimes what's new is really very old.
Yes.
Right.
It's true.
And so now that school had a really remarkable principal. I think his name was Russ Marshall,
Yes.
much admired for his particular talent as an administrator. Do you recall him?
I do, and unfortunately I never worked with him as a teacher. When I came on doing practice teaching, he and Peter Clark were co-principals in that last couple of years, I guess, or last year. And when I started teaching at the junior high, I had Henry Frank as a principal at the intermediate school. But back to Mr. Marshall. Mr. Marshall, to me, was a man of integrity. He was quiet-spoken. I never heard him raise his voice. He commanded respect just by his persona. And I think every boy and girl, grades 7 through 12, admired him very, very much. I can't say anything about how he was to work for.
It was interesting that you mentioned that. Occasionally he'd have a meeting of all the students in the auditorium.
The assemblies.
And he'd get up on that stage there, and it usually was something serious. Somebody had done something. In this case, somebody had put in a skunk in a teacher's car. And nobody knew who did it, yet Russ Marshall looked right down at one. I know the boy, I'm not even going to get involved in that, but he looked right at him, although he was speaking to the whole assembly. He says, that is a terrible thing you did. And everybody knew at that time who that person was. And as one of my first functions as an administrator was to go and get the skunk out of the car.
Yes, above and beyond the call of duty.
Yeah.
Right.
When Kalpe mentioned the assemblies, we would all gather in the auditorium quickly, and he would come out on stage, and everything calmed right down, for the most part. I mean, there might be some whispering here or there, but he just had that persona of, that gravitas that exuded confidence and respect.
Yeah, very nice.
Yeah.
And you very often were quite surprised about what your duties were going to be. I understand that so sometimes it came as a surprise. For example, walking into an assembly and finding out that you were going to be a director of, and so you became a baseball coach.
Oh no, I was. Oh yeah, well that was. I had the junior in '55. You see, I started at $3,000 as a teacher, and that
A year.
Here, and the reason I could have gone to Martha's Vineyard for $3,200, and I could have gone, I forget where else that was, for $2,800. My wife didn't want to go to the island. She says, I don't want to go back and forth. I said, all right. So we ended up in Falmouth. At that time, Mr. Merson was a great thinking man, and he tried to diversify the academic population itself. And he was always changing and looking for different types of experiences that he could bring to the student body. He was a wonderful man. He was a man of all ages, let's put it that way. Anyway, I did coach a little bit, but then we had a wonderful athletic director, and his name, and physical ed. At that time, there was just one job: athletic director and physical education director, and that was Earl Mills.
Oh, yes.
And he is certainly a star of stars in our mind.
Yes.
He was
In this community.
He was an outstanding individual. There's nothing he couldn't do to help kids, always. So anyway, we did with the. I'll tell you the truth right now. I lost. I apologize, but I just lost my train of thought.
Well, you were talking about these schools, and we were asking about your duties. That
Well,
were
I
surprising.
don't like to say too much about. Then I became track coach.
You became
And I was very successful. That there was a lot of young men, and I would say that one of the things that helped us was that as a six-year high school, we were able to use those youngsters, to develop those youngsters that young, 7, 8, and 9. Seventh grader could play with the varsity. If you had somebody that was really outstanding, then the varsity coaches would bring these youngsters up. Even as an 8th grader, I remember one young man named John Souza, who went on to be he was a left-handed pitcher and became a great baseball pitcher. And he was on my team as an 8th grader at that time, because I had the junior high kids.
Yeah.
And next thing I know, Joe Elietta, who was the baseball coach, comes down and says, "No, John Souza is going to come and pitch the game." And he pitched the varsity game, and he won it. And
Wow. What a thrill
yeah,
for him.
and I'll tell you another quick story about John Souza. Again, as I was a baseball coach, we had a big game coming up, and John was supposed to pitch. I said, "Where's John?" "He's in catechism." I said, "Catechism? What's catechism?" And he said, "Well, where is he?" He says, "He's over at St. Anthony's Church." Okay, so I got in my car, and I go over to St. Anthony's Church. And I think Father Avila was the
Yes.
priest at the time. And I said, "Father," I said, "I need John." He turned around at me and says, "God needs him more."
How
And that was the end of
interesting.
John Souza pitching that day.
I see. Yes. That's a great story.
A lot of what Kalpe is saying is strikes me after the war, World War II, and of course Korean War. We saw a large influx of male teachers coming in.
Oh, yes.
And Kalpe has mentioned some of their names, which makes me think back to the time, being a student in the 1950s.
Right.
And some of whom I taught with later, as I started to teach.
I wonder if the GI Bill, which was remarkable in changing American culture, the fact that soldiers could then get a college education, and many of them went into teaching.
I think you're right on that.
Yeah.
I think it's very true.
Yes.
Kalpe might know more about that part of it, but there really were. I mean, there were male teachers before, don't get me wrong. You know, some of the older, you know, like
Yeah, there was a good.
Mr. Barrows from East
Yeah.
Falmouth and T-Ticket
Right.
School and Henry Hall, things like that.
Right,
But
but not as many as
not
when.
as many and not as diversified as this group that were coming in.
Yes.
You know, that were taking over.
So when you were a student, then you
I
had
was
lots of male teachers.
Yes, I did.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Starting, incidentally, at the old village school, we had Frank Berry, V-E-R-R-E, and he taught grade 5. And then there were a couple in the junior high, at the Hall School for grade 6. But really, once we got to the new Lawrence High School, which is now Lawrence, that was where we saw most of the new male teachers.
Yes. Some of them went on to become principals.
That's
Can
correct.
you have some names of some principals of maybe the schools as we developed the T-Ticket School and others?
There was a man who was a teacher in grade 6 at the Hall School, Mr. Berry, B-E-R-R-Y, and he became principal at one of the Barnstable school system, one of those. I'm not
Yes.
sure which one. But some of the others moved up to assistant principal, like Paul Wasseth.
Paul Wasseth, yeah, he
and,
went in.
Yeah, and
And I
And,
remember teaching at Falmouth High School with Sidney Roberts. Was he one of your colleagues?
There was a 5th grade teacher at the Hall School, I think, and he became principal at the. He died. He died young. In fact, there's a plaque for him. There's a monument there on the Cape Cod Country Club golf course.
see.
But his name is on the tip of my tongue, and I'm sorry, I just
I
can't
see.
remember him. But Morway
I
was his
see.
name.
Oh,
And
Paul.
Morway,
Yes.
and he was a teacher, and then he became a principal.
Yes.
it's up in North Marshy, Douthart.
Right.
He was
Yeah.
a teacher and then a principal. But Sid Roberts, I believe Mr. Roberts came earlier in that earlier group of men. He was my teacher in high school for civics. He was a dad advisor for D. Malay, a boys group. He was my practice teacher when I was learning.
Yeah.
I enjoyed working with him very much. But he came, I think, in the 1930s or maybe in the 40s. I don't think he was part of World War II.
Yeah,
Well, I do want to say something about Otis, too.
Good.
In the old day, in that Lawrence High School, there was the classrooms. I had room 112, and across the hall from my school was the principal's office. I mean, the superintendent's office.
Oh, the superintendent's office was in the school.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's interesting.
And on the other side was room 108. But in the middle was a space. And that space became the audiovisual center. And guess who was working in the audiovisual center? Otis with Stanley Eldridge, these
Really?
two young men. And what they did was, and I was in charge, was that a teacher needed a projector of either a film projector or what do you call the other?
Slide projector.
Slide projectors. They notified us, and then the boys would come on there during their study hall periods, their free periods, and they'd work in there with me or in that room. And then they would deliver
Right.
that equipment and pick it up at the end of that session as well.
Was that something you enjoyed doing?
It was, and I could see the movie or the slides,
Yeah, right.
whatever the teacher was offering.
Right,
so.
right. Your sort of, your stint, high tech of the 50s.
Yeah, compared to now trying to do remotes and things like that.
Right.
So.
I'll tell you another interesting story was when I was a track coach, a new 8-pound shot put to be used indoors. It had some kind of material on the inside, and it was all plastic on the outside. And of course, we were throwing it in the gymnasium, which is, by the way, named after Russell Marshall. So there was a complaint, or some of the somebody else had said, you know, this might be dangerous. I said, oh, no, they guarantee this is going to be good. And Russ Marshall came to me and said, listen, he said, we have a complaint here about damage that this is going to cost. So I said, well, come on down, Russ, and I'll show you. And there I had Bruce Magato, who was a shot put
really
competitor. And so he's standing there, and the width of the gymnasium is 50 feet. That's the way. So he launched one out, and went high in the air, and came down and broke the floor.
Really? That was the end of...
No, but I mean, it wasn't supposed to happen, but it must have been a weak spot in the floor itself.
No doubt.
Another incident
Well,
occurred.
wait, did that end the...
No, as a matter of fact.
But let's stop. Bruce was a student.
Yes.
What grade?
He was,
Probably.
at the time, I believe Bruce was a sophomore.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then in the wintertime, we still had to compete. And so we used to throw the shot put indoors. And I brought in a coach from Wareham High School. Albert Longy was his name. And he was an expert on the fundamentals of the shot put. And I had the kids there to learn. And Alan launched one up, and it hit the corner of the glass backboard and shattered the glass backboard. Now, I had to run to Russ, because there was a game that night.
Oh, my goodness.
We had to have we were going to have a basket. We had no basket. So, but Russ, with his magic, however he did it, he got a glass backboard there and installed so they could play the game that night.
That very evening. That's remarkable.
That's why they named that gym Marshall Gymnasium.
Yes,
But this is a funny side story on that. One of the L's fell down off his name that's up above.
Oh, I didn't know.
So my wife and I were coming up, I guess, something at the school when I was a teacher there, and she said, "Who's Marcia L?" So I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "It says Marcia L Gymnasium." I said, "It's for Marshall."
Right.
You know, the L fell down.
Yeah, that you had that shortly repaired.
Yes,
Put up.
yeah.
Yes.
Barbara, you were going to talk about how things changed.
Well, first, before we get into that, I think we must say that there's something about your background was not in athletics, but you became a coach with many awards. So there must be. Tell us about what your secret was with students. You managed to turn out champion athletes. And of baseball, short put,
well, no, baseball was a short year, and it was all in the minors. But the varsity end, it was I was very fortunate to be able to corral youngsters that had never been involved, that lived on Sandwich Road and in Mashpee. We had some tremendous athletes from Mashpee as well. And for one reason or another, they took a liking to me. They were always at the school, but other than very few would ever be involved. For some reason, I was able to corral them and get them involved, and we were very fortunate. And
I suspect that you built a personal relationship with them, that you knew them, and knowing one student well is critical.
You see, let me tell you something. as a teacher and as a coach, you have to understand one thing. With kids make mistakes. If they didn't make mistakes, they don't need us. That's the whole story.
Yes.
That's the game. And again, when they make a mistake, it's how you approach that situation and how you deal with that as an individual.
Yes.
And some, and that's how you get the different
What he has
names
said probably explains the genius of Russ Marshall, knowing how to deal with somebody who's...
It's something I was mentioning to you before that I tried to do, pretty much what Kalpe's talking about, that you didn't fault the kid like he's an awful boy or, not a nice girl or whatever. Yeah. You address whatever the action was, that you didn't like their action,
Yeah.
you were ashamed of the language that they used, that kind of a thing.
Yes.
And approach it from that way. And I think Kalpe's doing the same.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I always thought of myself more of a cheerleader than a coach.
Oh, really? Really?
Yeah, that it was.
In passing, is it? May I ask what some of those awards were?
Oh, well, the award. Obviously, we won. I don't know. I think one stretch we had 8 state championships right in a row, and I really I do know that I was elected to the High School Hall of Fame. Then I was elected to the State Track Coaches Hall of Fame. In '91, I was elected to the United States High School Coaches Hall of Fame.
Really?
And also in '91, I was selected by the Massachusetts Principals Association as the outstanding principal for that year. I mean, they picked a principal one year, an assistant principal another year. And in '91, they sent us out to Chicago as part of a program where there was an assistant principal from each state. And we sat there and we discussed problems of a much bigger nature with relation to education for a whole week. So that was, and also in 55, 56, there was a program called Atoms for Peace. And again, that was in Chicago. And I was elected the science teacher of the Cape, and I was sent to that conference as well.
I see.
I was able to take my wife at the same time too, which was nice.
And that's when you were teaching at Lawrence High School.
That's correct.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That was a busy and a fulfilling career.
Well, certainly, it
Well
just,
deserving.
yeah. Well, thank
Yes,
you.
yes.
It grew.
Right.
It just grew
Right.
for
And
some
Otis,
reason or another.
it's probably interesting for you to meet people today who were your students who
It's true.
will look back on a particular lesson or class that maybe you've forgotten, but they haven't.
I was telling you a story once about a student I have who's involved in the town government now, and he was talking, I remember the time when we had chosen a certain stock. I would have the kids at junior high actually buy stock. Everyone contributed $1 or something like that from several classes. And I had forgotten all about that, but it made quite an impression upon him, following the stock. He knew which stocks we bought.
Right. Oh, years later he remembered
Years
all
later,
that.
as an adult.
Yeah.
He was telling me this when we had seen each other at a gathering. And I thought that was kind of remarkable, but you never knew what kind of an impression you'd have on some
Exactly.
student,
Yes.
earlier in life.
How true. This is often said about teaching,
Right.
that you never really know what your influence is.
Yeah. And hopefully it's all good.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes, hopefully. And so, well, now, looking at the past, I'll ask you first, Jim. What do you think then was very different from the way teaching might be now?
Well, when we first started out, the philosophy was to bring a youngster as far as you could in education. In other words, don't flunk them. That was the whole story. And if you flunk too many kids, you got a message to come and see the superintendent. Never mind the principal. You had to see the superintendent. Also, the feeling was that both discipline and education belonged in that classroom. And when you closed the two doors, they felt the teacher was lord and master in that classroom and should take care of the discipline problems. If, for instance, you send too many kids to detention or actually kick them out of class and send them to the principal's office, you got a visit from the principal saying, stop that.
So
take care of your own problems.
Right. A good teacher was a good class manager, right?
Yeah, I remember another situation where Russ Marshall and I had to go to court to testify on a youngster that was really, and I forget what the incident was, but it was bad enough so we had to go to court. And the judge turned around and looked right at Russ Marshall and said, "What are you doing here?" he said. "Can't you take care of your own things at school?" That was, poor man was embarrassed. It was a terrible situation at that time. We really, we left with our tails hanging below as we walked out.
That may not be too different from today, where there's much emphasis on outcomes, on student accomplishment, and so teachers are accountable for that.
There's a lot of much more advancement, of course, with technology. When you think that iPads, my grandchildren at the Mullen School and the intermediate school, Morse Pond School, and the older ones have the tablets. So during the COVID, they can go on those tablets and work, things like that.
Yes.
We never thought of that before.
Social media has made such a difference.
And Jim mentioned about the Operators Club having the slide projectors. I don't think any kid would know what a slide projector is today, because any videos we see are shown on differently.
Yes.
So and we don't have blackboards; we have the whiteboards now.
Exactly.
To write on.
Yes.
And so a lot of technology has come into play, even since he and I have left teaching.
Yes. Right. It really is quite different. Many different challenges. Some of the same challenges, the kind that Jim mentioned, that is class management and knowing your students well. But so that we've looked at the past, and we've seen some similarities and some differences, and I don't want to end without having some final stories that perhaps we have not talked about. Anything else that you can think about that?
No, not offhand, without naming names.
Yes. Jim?
Well, like I said, it was a wonderful experience. And I was a pre-med in college. And quite frankly, I was playing both basketball and baseball in college. And you can't study for pre-med and play ball, much to my father's chagrin, but we won't go into that. Right. So I got married, and I had a child coming along, so I had to do something in my senior year differently. So I jumped out of that and got into education, and I'm not sorry one bit.
That's
nor am I.
wonderful.
For the years I've been
You look
involved.
back on a fulfilled career.
Well, I grew up in Falmouth, went to Falmouth Schools, ended up teaching in Falmouth, and have stayed here my entire life. But I think teaching helps keep you young too, and I don't mean necessarily physically,
Right.
but I mean that mental,
Yes.
awareness.
Right. Being around young people.
That's the key.
Yeah.
That's really very important.
Yeah.
Being around young people really picks you up.
Yes, I quite
Yeah.
agree. I quite agree.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for being our oral historians and for telling us these stories, and also for urging getting some of our viewers to check those postcards that are available on the website of the Falmouth Public Library, a very remarkable collection of historic postcards. And I so thank you very much for being with us. And I'll turn to viewers and thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you again.
Thank you, our pleasure.
All right, wonderful.